A young girl went out to ride her bicycle in the yard, but when her mother came to check on her a few minutes later, the girl was nowhere to be found. The worried woman called 911, but the police couldn't locate her daughter for 2 long years. The fate of the girl remained unknown until a shocking turn of events. Detectives finally uncovered the truth about her disappearance, but none of them expected the truth to be so heinous. Before we start this video, I would highly request you to subscribe to our channel and like this video to support us. This is samtv. Poulton was born on September 20th, 1989 in Rochester, New York. She was the only child in the family, and her parents gave her all their attention and love. When she turned 3, they decided to get divorced, and Kay stayed with her mom. Her father maintained a good relationship with his ex-wife and visited his daughter all the time. Kay's mom, Judy, moved to an apartment complex located in a quiet suburban area of Rochester, despite her ex-husband helping to take care of their daughter. Judy had some financial difficulties. When Kay was 4, her mom took on a part-time job to save up enough money for a trip to Disney World. With her daughter the following summer, Judy's job was delivering magazines to customers in her neighborhood on the evening of May 23, 1994. She was getting ready for her shift. She was sitting at home placing leaflets into the magazines before heading out to deliver them around 6:45 p.m. Kay asked to go out for a walk. It was a beautiful sunny evening outside, and she wanted to ride her tricycle. Judy looked outside and saw that there were plenty of other kids playing in the yard, so she agreed to let her daughter go out for a few minutes. She told her to stay within the yard, and Kay ran out onto the street with her tricycle. Judy had only a few minutes left to finish with the leaflets. After that, she planned to deliver the magazines and take Kay to McDonald's. Once she was done, she grabbed the magazines and took them to the car, planning to call Kay back home. But when Judy stepped outside, her daughter wasn't there. She looked around, called out her name, and there was no response. Judy walked around the yard, then began to roam the complex grounds, but Kay was nowhere to be seen. The mother also didn't hear the sounds of her tricycle. When Kay rode it on the street, its wheels made quite a noticeable creaking noise, but it was silent outside with each passing second. Judy's panic grew, and her cries quickly gathered the neighbors' attention. She asked them if anyone had seen her daughter, but only a few people had seen her in the yard with other children and didn't know where she had gone upon learning that KY had disappeared. The neighbors joined the search, but they couldn't find her or her bicycle. Most of the complex territory was covered with trees, and around it was a fence separating the houses from the nearby highway. Judy was sure that her daughter couldn't have gone anywhere on her own. Kay knew she was only allowed to ride in their yard, and she had never disobeyed her mother before. She also couldn't have gone far on her small bike, and she would have been found right away, fearing the worst. Judy decided to call. The police officers arrived on the scene within minutes and immediately began searching. Soon they were joined by firefighters and canine units. While searching the complex and its surroundings, officers went door-to-door. The police strongly believed that Kay was still somewhere at the complex. If this was a case of abduction, the most logical suspects were its residents. An outsider would hardly have been able to enter the premises, snatch Kay from the yard, and drive away without anyone noticing. The complex had 300 units, and the residents willingly let the police in, sincerely wanting to help find the girl in cases where no one was home. The complex manager used spare keys to let the officers inside. Unfortunately, all of this yielded no results. Kay and her bicycle were not found in any apartment. The search continued throughout the night, and around 4 a.m. the case was reclassified as a kidnapping. A special unit took over, and detectives asked Judy if there was anyone in their lives who might wish them harm. They asked about Kyle's father, but Judy denied his possible involvement because he had absolutely no reason to kidnap his daughter. The detectives asked if there was anyone among the complex residents who behaved strangely or suspiciously, and Judy shared one observation. She mentioned a 22-year-old man named Mark, who had recently moved into the complex with his wife and 1.5-year-old son. According to Judy, Mark's behavior seemed very unusual and even alarming. They had met a few times in the yard and engaged in small conversations. Once he said her daughter was very beautiful. Judy had often heard similar compliments from others, but the tone in which Mark said it seemed weird to her. After that, he added something even more unsettling. He said he had been watching all the little girls in the complex, and Kay was the prettiest. Obviously, these words seemed highly suspicious to the mother, and after that, she tried to avoid any contacts with Mark, although they continued to occasionally see each other in the yard. And once he asked Judy a very alarming question. He inquired if Kay would tell her if someone tried to touch her. Judy answered yes and immediately left the yard. considering such questions extremely suspicious. Prior to these conversations with Mark, Kay liked to play with his son on the playground, but since then, Judy didn't let her daughter near him. Even in her presence during the conversation with detectives, Judy remembered something else about a few minutes after she went outside to look for her daughter. She saw Mark in the yard coming out with his son to the playground. She asked him if he had seen Kay, and the man said no. Judy also noticed something strange, but at that moment she didn't pay much attention to it as her mind was preoccupied with fear for her daughter. She saw that his sneakers were missing shoelaces. The detectives decided to talk to Mark and brought him in for questioning. The man denied any involvement in Kyle's disappearance and even agreed to take a polygraph test. The operator didn't detect any false answers, so Mark had to be released. Also, Judy herself basically provided him with an alibi as she saw the man on the playground with his son at the exact time when she was looking for her daughter. The police also searched his apartment in the early hours of the investigation, but they didn't find Kyle's bicycle or the girl herself. Thus, Mark stopped being considered a suspect, and the detectives continued their investigation with no leads in hand. They began to check Judy for possible involvement in her daughter's disappearance. Judy understood that this was a standard procedure and repeatedly answered all their questions. However, the fact that the police, lacking other suspects, were spending so much time on her only added to her suffering. Information about Kyle's disappearance soon appeared in local news, as well as on billboards and flyers. Throughout the city, the police received numerous calls with tips, the total number of which quickly exceeded 1,000, and investigators quickly checked on each one. Unfortunately, they all led to dead ends, and eventually the case went cold for months. Despite the lack of progress, Judy never stopped hoping to find her daughter alive. She left her job and dedicated all her time to search. She's been printing and posting flyers, contacting various media outlets, and overall doing everything to keep the case in the public eye. She was also joined by some compassionate people who not only helped distribute flyers but also managed to raise $100,000, which was offered as a reward for any useful information about Kyle's disappearance. Judy even mentioned to get this case covered on national television. She was invited to the Oprah Winfrey Show, and information about her daughter's disappearance appeared twice on a popular TV show dedicated to unsolved crimes. Judy also collaborated with local businesses to have flyers with information about Kyle's disappearance constantly present in their offices, establishments, and on commercial vehicles. She even persuaded 2 airlines to include these flyers in envelopes with tickets. All of this helped to gather new leads, and the police diligently investigated each one, but they never managed to come close to solving the case. This went on for 2 years until something unexpected happened. On August 9, 1996, a woman called the police and told them about a serious argument she had with her husband. According to her, she was tired of her husband's strange behavior and stated that she wanted to divorce him in response. The man began to persuade her not to do that and tried to evoke her sympathy while telling her how difficult things were for him. The man suddenly confessed to his wife that he had killed Kay, plunging his wife into deep shock. The woman immediately took their child, went to her father's house, and called 911. Finally, she revealed her husband's name to the police. It was Mark Christie. Judy's neighbor detectives were surprised by his wife's story, but they immediately encountered a serious problem under the state law. Any information shared between spouses was protected and could not be used in court. In other words, even if Mark wasn't lying, the police were not allowed to arrest or question him. Also, as we remember, the man's apartment was searched in the early hours of the investigation, and he's been in the yard with his child shortly after Kyle's disappearance, so the police doubted he had the time to kidnap and kill her. Despite this, Detective Crow, who listened to Mark's wife's story, decided to talk to him. He found out that the man and his family moved out of Kyle's complex just a few weeks after her disappearance due to some very serious accusations. It turned out Mark had been reported by the parents of 2 girls for standing naked in his doorway, in plain sight. No investigation was conducted on this matter because technically he was in his own home, but the fact itself seemed extremely suspicious to the detective. Mark had moved to another city located 50 mi from Rochester, and Crow headed there. But he was met with an unpleasant surprise instead of Mark. His mother opened the door and said that her son wouldn't talk to the police without a lawyer present whom they had already called. It seemed that Mark had learned about his wife called to the police, and Detective Crow realized there wasn't much for him to do in this situation, since a confession made to his spouse couldn't be used in court. Mark's lawyer could easily prohibit the police from speaking to his client, allowing Mark to continue living freely without fear of prosecution. But Crow wasn't ready to give up yet. While he was talking to Mark's mother, The man himself eventually came out, and the detective managed to convince him that he just wanted to ask a few questions about Kay's case. Crow suggested they drive to the nearest restaurant and chat over a cup of coffee. To his surprise, Mark agreed, but on the condition that the detective would take him to his lawyer afterward. They stopped at an Italian restaurant nearby, and during the whole time the detective engaged in casual conversation with Mark, trying not to push things or pressure him, and this tactic paid off while they were waiting for their order. Mark suddenly started talking. He expressed regret for what he had done to Kay, saying that his actions had haunted him for the past 2 years. According to him, he constantly saw Kaylee in the news and on flyers, and her face haunted him everywhere. Crow continued to proceed cautiously, not wanting to spook Mark with excessive pressure. He had known him since the early days of the investigation. But this wasn't their first conversation. Crow believed that Mark was proud of himself because he outsmarted police and avoided punishment, so the detective decided to play on his ego. He told Mark that he had indeed managed to deceive the entire team of investigators working on the case, and this tactic proved effective. Mark replied that he didn't want to sound like he was proud of himself, but the way he got rid of the bicycle was truly ingenious. Mark asked the detective if he wanted to know the details. However, he warned him he would only talk about the bicycle and nothing more. Crow continued to maintain a soft, even friendly tone to avoid scaring Mark and to gather as much information as possible, reassuring him that he didn't have to talk about anything he didn't want to. Then Mark stated that Kayle's tricycle had been in his apartment for 3 days since her disappearance. He knew that police would search every apartment because when a child is in danger, they don't need a warrant, but there was some sort of loophole in the law. It allowed police to search for a missing child, but not for evidence. It means they could only search places where a child could fit. Mark quickly decided to cut the bike into pieces and hide them in different parts of the apartment that were obviously too small to fit a child. For example, he wrapped some parts in clothes and fit them in closets, while others he placed in small bags and took them out to his car. He then gradually disposed of them, taking the pieces far away from home. Police officers were stationed at the exit of the complex, inspecting each car, but like with the apartment, they were only looking for the missing girl, so the small bags didn't attract their attention. Listening to this, Detective Crow realized he had a strong chance of obtaining a full confession from Mark. He began to tell him that perhaps Kay's death wasn't his fault and it was a tragic accident. In response, Mark asked what present sentence he could face, and Crow replied that most likely it would be around 25 years. Mark said that it would be unfair to him to make him spend half his life behind bars away from his wife and son. He also added that for the past 2 years he had been living in his personal hell, and that should count for something in sentencing. Despite the obvious lack of sense in these words, Crow continued with his tactic and told Mark that perhaps he should ease his suffering and tell what really happened. Mark replied that he is ready to confess everything, but only after talking to a lawyer. Of course, the detective understood that no lawyer would allow his client to confess to a crime, even if he really committed it, if there was no evidence against him. So he decided to be honest with Mark about this and added that, in that case, Kyle's parents would never know what happened to their daughter, or if she suffered before her death. And then Mark replied she didn't suffer. The detective sensed that the man was ready to confess everything, so he said it was time to do the right thing for himself, his family. And God, upon hearing this, Mark looked at the detective and finally admitted to what he had done. He repeated that the girl didn't suffer, and he said he had strangled her. He immediately added that he hadn't done anything else to her, according to Mark. That evening, Kay came to his apartment and asked to play with his 1.5-year-old son. He let her in and took her bike to the kitchen. He knew Kayle's mother wouldn't allow her to come to this place, so he decided not to attract attention. Kay went upstairs to the second floor of the apartment to the children's room where she started playing with the child. About 10 minutes later, Mark heard Judy in the yard calling her daughter's name, and he panicked. He realized that her mother would be furious that he had let the girl into his house without her permission. So Mark went up to the children's room and strangled Kay with his bare hands. Detective Crow immediately had doubts about some parts of this story. It seemed much more likely that Mark himself lured Kay into his apartment under the pretext of playing with his son, taking advantage of the fact that his wife was at work there. He could have tried to molest her, and when he heard Judy calling her name, he might have become frightened that Kay would tell her everything. The detective also remembered that Judy saw him outside wearing sneakers without laces, suggesting that he had used them to strangle the victim. This would mean that the crime was not as spontaneous, as he would have had time to think it over while taking the laces out of his shoes. Apparently, Mark tried to minimize the severity of his crime by changing some details in this story, but Crow understood that if he voiced his doubts, Mark might change his mind and refused to say what he did with the body, and the detective needed to obtain this information, so he continued to play along and listen to the story. Mark claimed that after committing the murder, he took Kayle's body to the kitchen and left her on the floor. Then he took his son and went outside to create an alibi for himself. He kept hearing Judy call her daughter in the yard, so he deliberately wanted to be seen by her and dispel any suspicions after the woman saw him in the playground and went to search the complex territory. Mark returned home and placed Kay's body in a laundry basket, covering it with clothes. A few minutes later, he took the basket outside and placed it in the trunk of his car. By that time, there were already many people in the yard helping Judy look for her daughter. According to Mark, there was such chaos that nobody even noticed him. Mark also took his son with him and drove to the company where he worked as a security guard. He parked near the back of the huge building and left the basket with Kay's body by the door, then drove around and entered through the main entrance. Given that Mark had the day off, he lied to his coworkers about forgetting something at work. The story didn't raise any suspicions, so Mark walked through the building and opened the back door from the inside. He took the basket with the victim's body and climbed onto a huge 30,000-gallon tank filled with liquid coolant. He opened the top lid and dropped Kay in, first tying a heavy metal object to her. Afterwards, he disposed of all the victim's clothes, but specified that he didn't remove the victim's earrings once done disposing of the body. He returned home and immediately joined the search for Kay with the other neighbors. Basically, he managed to remove the body from the complex even before the police got involved, and no one noticed anything. At the end of his confession, he stated that killing Kay was a big mistake, and he shouldn't have done it. Having obtained all the necessary information, Crow paid for their food, and Mark left a $2 tip. Then he willingly went with a detective to the station, where he was arrested on a charge of murder. As soon as Mark's lawyer learned about his confession, he tried to withdraw it, but it didn't work out. Mark provided all the information voluntarily, and Detective Crow didn't break any laws. The police immediately went to Mark's workplace and opened the tank. 2 years later, the victim's body was still inside, although the degree of decomposition didn't allow experts to determine the cause of death or any other details. They could only confirm her identity, and Judy finally got to bury her daughter. Mark admitted his guilt to the judge and was sentenced to a minimum of 25 years in prison. Just as Detective Crow had told him, the man's lawyer managed to negotiate a deal where his client had the kidnapping charges dropped and only faced punishment for the murder. But Mark's story didn't end there. In 2010, the police reopened an old case. From 1988, a 74-year-old woman named Viola Manville was brutally murdered while taking a walk in a suburb of Rochester. Detectives had several suspects, including Mark, who was only 16 at the time, but he had passed a polygraph test during interrogation, showing no signs of deception. Eventually, a man named Frank Sterling was arrested for the crime. At first, he denied his guilt. But after a relentless overnight interrogation, he confessed to the murder after being in prison. Frank tried to appeal his sentence, claiming that the police cohered his confession and that by the end of the interrogation, he could barely comprehend what was happening. However, all of Frank's attempts to prove his innocence failed until 2010, when the case was reopened and all existing evidence was sent to the lab. Experts found a DNA sample from the suspect, which did not match Frank's, but perfectly matched another inmate from the FBI database. Mark Christie. In 2011, at the age of 39, Mark confessed to Viola's murder and received an additional 28 years in prison. However, he did not disclose the motives for his actions and showed no remorse. As for Frank, he was released from prison after 19 years of wrongful imprisonment. He sued the authorities and received nearly $10 million in 2014, but just 3 years later, he died of a heart attack at the age of 54. Mark continues to serve his sentence in prison, but he may be eligible for parole in a few years. However, there are no guarantees of his release. It is worth noting that if investigators in Viola Manville's case had not fixated on another suspect and coerced him into confessing to a crime he didn't commit, Mark might have been incarcerated earlier and he wouldn't have the opportunity to kill Kay. Unfortunately, things turned out differently. Alright, guys, share your thoughts on this story in the comment section and don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Thank you for watching.